the background, or he might even make an appearance on camera at some point. So he's he's an unpredictable participant.
All right, we are now recording, and Kim, I'm going to make you the host again.
Okay, well, welcome to the October Southwest Neighborhoods Inc. Public Safety Committee meeting. Thank you to Chris Thomas, who is here to give the rules of the road presentation. So Sylvia, is everything set up for Chris to share a screen and all that?
Yes.
Okay, so if you need to, you got it.
Great.
And without further ado, we don't really have a full agenda for this evening. So my thought was to just do the presentation, and then afterward we could discuss any neighborhood concerns anybody had. We've already got a presentation set up for next month. So I'm just going to turn it over to Chris if you want to introduce yourself.
All right. Thank you, Kim. And how long do we have roughly for the presentation?
How much time do you need?
Well, I can do a more condensed version in say like half an hour, and I can do a more detailed version in about 45 minutes, 50 minutes, something like that.
Let's do the full meal deal.
Version.
Okay. All right. Very good. Well, I appreciate the enthusiasm. Thank you all for having me. My name is Chris Thomas. My son Wells Thomas is also in attendance, as I said, and I apologize for any distractions. It's kind of the way things go these days. Kids make an appearance now and then. And I'm an attorney at Thomas Kuhn, Newton & Frost. We are a law firm that was started in 1980, and we represent people in personal injury, Social Security, disability, and workers' compensation cases all across Oregon. And a passion of ours is representing bicyclists and pedestrians. Many of the attorneys at our law firm, including myself, are bicyclists. And we have sort of specialized in bicycle law over the years. And as part of that sort of specialization, we have advocated for improved laws in the Oregon legislature. And we've also tried to outreach to the community about bicyclists' rights and responsibilities. And our partner in that effort is the Street Trust, which was formerly the Bicycle Transportation Alliance. And they have, for a long time, advocated on behalf of bicyclists, and more recently incorporated pedestrians and transit users into their scope. And so we partner with them for these clinics. They help us get the word out. And if you don't know about the Street Trust, I would encourage you all to check them out because they're a great organization. A little bit about me personally. I grew up in Northeast Portland. I actually attended law school in Southwest Portland at Lewis and Clark, and spent a few years living right underneath the tram there on Barber Boulevard. And my wife and I live in Northeast Portland now. We've got 3 young boys. I bike commute. I race my bicycle. We've got a law firm sponsored racing team. No racing is happening this year, unfortunately. And I am one of the newer additions to our legal team at the law firm, but am really enjoying practicing personal injury law generally, and in particular, bicycle and pedestrian cases. And so I've got a presentation lined up. I'll share my screen with you all so you can see the PowerPoint. I want to let you know that it's intended to be interactive, and so if you have any questions that pop up along the way, I'd be more than happy to answer them. And hopefully we can have some discussions about, particular fact patterns that you all have encountered or pieces of infrastructure that you've wondered about. Because I know there's a lot of new and interesting stuff going on in this world. So bear with me for a second. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. All right. Are you able to see it okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Good. Thanks. All right. So this is our law firm here, Thomas Kuhn and Frost. If you're interested in some written materials, we've got several books that we've written as a law firm on bicycle law, pedestrian law, electric scooters, and electric bicycles. And those are all at our bike-specific website, OregonBikeLaw.com. And we've also got a lot of blog posts and things that might be of interest. So I like to start with a sort of a framing of the importance of knowing what the law is, which is kind of intuitive, I think, to know what you are and aren't supposed to do. But a common reason that folks want to know the law is so they don't get a ticket, avoiding a citation. And pardon the noise. But in our world, as civil attorneys, what we encounter, hey buddy, hey buddy, hey, what we encounter more often is when a collision happens. And one of the ways that that juries and judges decide who is at fault for causing a collision is to look at the applicable statutes. And so if people were unaware that a statute required them to do something and they got in a collision, then they might be found liable for it despite not realizing they were doing something wrong. So we think it's really important to kind of get the word out about what the statutes are, so that if something does happen, that the law can be on your side. So sort of an overarching statute that governs bicyclists generally is this one. It's ORS 814-400. And what it says is that bicyclists are subject to vehicle laws generally. And so if you look through the vehicle code, you see laws governing vehicle use, of course, things like following the speed limit, stopping at traffic signals, all the vehicle code provisions that we know.
Actually, I love this art in it. So good.
And what makes bicyclists subject to those vehicle laws is this statute. And so what the statute says is that bicycles are treated as vehicles unless one of these two exceptions applies. And one of the exceptions is that if a law by its very nature can't apply, then it doesn't. So an example is vehicle emission requirements. Obviously, bicycles don't emit pollutants, and so can't be required to go to the DEQ. Another one is if a statute specifically says that bicyclists are not subject to it. So for example, if you look at the Oregon law regarding driver's license, there's a specific provision that says bicycle riders don't have to have a license, so it doesn't apply. But otherwise, the general rule is that bicyclists are subject to vehicle laws. And this can have some sort of interesting consequences. So if you look at the Oregon driving under the influence statute, what it says is that a person commits the offense of DUI if they drive a vehicle while intoxicated. It doesn't say except bicycles, or otherwise clearly not apply to bikes, and therefore it applies to bikes. And if someone's riding a bicycle while over the legal limit and they get pulled over, they can get a DUI as if they were driving a 2-ton motor vehicle, which it doesn't happen very often, but I have heard of it happening. And if the bicyclist has a driver's license, it can be suspended, and they've got to go through the whole same process as if they were driving a car. So that's one consequence. Another interesting example is if you look at sort of an ordinary traffic statute, impeding traffic. A person commits the offense of impeding traffic if they drive a motor vehicle in a manner that impedes traffic. And you might think, well, bicyclists don't have motors, or bicycles don't have motors, unless maybe it's an e-bike. And therefore, this statute shouldn't apply to bikes, because I said earlier that if a statute says it doesn't apply to bikes, then it doesn't. But this issue actually got tested by a fellow who got a citation on his bike, appealed it to the Oregon Court of Appeals, and the Court of Appeals said, actually, just having the term motor vehicle in a statute is not enough to specifically exempt bikes. And therefore, statutes that say motor vehicles may do this or may not do this may still apply to bikes, including this one. And so it sort of opens this Pandora's box a little bit for bicyclists to not really know where to draw the line. And it hasn't been tested in any other cases that I'm aware of. And so technically it only applies to this statute. But you know, it certainly could apply to a statute like the distracted driving one, which is the second one here. It says that a person commits the offense of driving a motor vehicle while using a cell phone if they drive a motor vehicle while using a cell phone. And clearly in this case, the impeding traffic case, that wasn't enough to exempt bikes. So we can kind of assume potentially that this one would also apply to bikes, and there's others. So it's not entirely clear where the line is between statutes that do and don't apply to bike riders sometimes.
Okay.
So there are statutes governing all kinds of things related to bicycle use. You know, there are, of course, statutes that govern how you can ride a bike, where you can ride a bike. And then these ones here actually govern the equipment that you have on the bike, and they're very specific. Hang on, buddy. Hey. So one of them that actually comes up a lot is the first one, lights. So this time of year especially, the days are getting shorter. This morning we had that thick fog, and you might wonder, well, what's the requirement for having lights on your bike? And the rule is that if there are limited visibility conditions, then you've got to have a front white light and a rear red reflector. Notice that you don't have to have a rear red light, just a red reflector. But most bicyclists decide that they are going to use a red light just to be extra careful. And limited visibility conditions is a defined term. It's sunrise to sunset, or when vehicles are not visible from 1,000 feet away. So this morning I was on a bike ride up on Skyline. Fog was thick, and I don't think you could see for 1,000 feet. And in that instance, I think lights would be required, at least the front light and the rear reflector. Helmets are another one that we often see. In Oregon, the rule is that if you're a rider or a passenger on a bike under the age of 16, you got to have a helmet. Another rule is that if you ride an e-scooter, you got to have a helmet no matter what age you are. Brakes. Oh, and did I hear that we may have gotten a question? Sorry, I'm not monitoring the chat box particularly well. If a question does come in on the chat, feel free to just read it out to me. Another statute governs brakes. So bicycles are actually required to have brakes that stop the bike in a certain distance at a certain speed. This is kind of an interesting one if you ever see folks on fixed gear bikes, which don't have conventional bike brakes. A judge found a few years ago that that those bikes failed to meet the definition of having brakes, and therefore were non-compliant. All right, the next thing I want to talk about are bike lanes, which we all, living in Portland, are familiar with. In the last 15, 20 years, we've seen a huge increase in the number of streets that have bike lanes, and unfortunately, a whole lot of the collisions that our law firm sees happen in bike lanes. Part of that's because of the volume of riders using bike lanes, But part of it is that a lot of drivers fail to adhere to, at least in the collisions that we see, this statute, which says that a driver has to yield to a bicyclist in a bike lane. And what that means is, if you are driving on a street with a bike lane and you are preparing to turn your car across that bike lane, then you've got to check your mirror and look over your shoulder and make sure that no bicyclist is approaching. Because if a bicyclist is approaching, you're required to slow down, stop, and not turn, and wait for them to pass through the intersection before turning. And it's a little bit counterintuitive because people aren't used to turning across lanes where traffic in that lane is going straight. But that is the law with respect to bike lanes. And unfortunately, based on, I think, the fact that a lot of folks learned to drive when there weren't as many bike lanes, or in places where there now aren't that many bike lanes, a whole lot of drivers don't practice that look. And it's sort of a difficult maneuver when you're driving to look and see something that's approaching from behind from potentially kind of far away. But the law is clear that drivers are required to yield to bike riders in bike lanes. Another statute that governs bike lanes is applies to bicycle riders. And what it says is that if there's a bike lane on the street you're riding on, you got to use it. And it doesn't matter if you're able to keep up with traffic in the motor vehicle lanes. If you're on a street, there's a bike lane there. The idea is that, we went through the trouble to build a bike lane, and if you're riding your bike, you ought to use it. Unless an exception applies. And the exceptions are kind of what you'd think. If there's, a person or a bike or something in the bike lane, you can go around them. If there's stuff in the bike lane like glass or, leaves, you can go around that. And if you're getting ready to turn and the bike lane's on one side of the street, you can leave the bike lane to turn, the other way. And just to go back to this one, so this is actually a street in Southwest Portland downtown, right by our office, Southwest 2nd. And it's got what they call a parking protected bike lane on the left side of the street. It's a bike lane that has a row of parked cars between it and the motor vehicle traffic. And I'm not a big fan of this bike lane because I feel like a lot of people don't realize it's there. And so I've had a lot of people turn across it while I'm riding in it. And in this instance, this statute is a little bit frustrating to comply with because traffic and motor vehicle traffic here is usually going pretty slow. I can usually keep up with it just fine if I'm taking the lane. But what the statute says is that if there's a bike lane, I got to use it even if I don't feel like it's necessarily as safe as taking the lane. So if you're on a street that doesn't have a bike lane and you're riding your bike, then the rule there is you got to ride as far to the right as practical, unless one of the exceptions applies. And the big exception is if you're not impeding traffic. So if you are, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the lighting, the traffic lights in downtown, but some people call it the green wave, where if you're driving through downtown and you go too fast, then you start to hit red lights. But if you slow down, I think it's 11 miles an hour, then as soon as you get to an intersection, it's green, and it keeps going that way all through downtown. That's kind of a nice thing for bicyclists who are able to take the lane under this statute, because a bike rider can ride through downtown at about 11 miles an hour, not impede traffic because of the signal timing, and take the lane. Other places where this comes up is on the east side of Portland. There are a lot of side streets called neighborhood greenways, which are quiet residential streets where there's not a lot of traffic and they're pretty narrow. And bike riders don't really want to be riding as far to the right as possible because it's already narrow as it is. And so if they're not impeding traffic, they're allowed to ride in the middle. Other exceptions to the obligation to ride as far to the right as practical. Again, like bike lanes, if you're passing a vehicle, if there's debris in the road, if you're on a one-way street, you can actually ride as far to the right or as far to the left as practical, which again is a handy thing in downtown when you got to turn left up a few blocks ahead on a one-way street. You can ride as far to the left as you can. Okay, sidewalk riding. This is kind of a hot button issue, particularly in dense areas. You know, it's certainly in the last few years with scooters in downtown and bike share and other sort of new and evolving transportation modes, there's been a lot of talk about sidewalk riding. And the general rule is that that you're allowed to ride on the sidewalk unless a local city ordinance prohibits it. So usually cities have something on the books that says in the downtown core area, you can't ride on the sidewalk. In Portland, there's a code provision that says between NATO and 13th, east to west, and Hoyt to Jefferson, north to south, you can't ride on the sidewalk. But outside of that area in Portland, you can. And in other cities, it's similar. It's, you know, sort of the commercial district, you might think. But if you're allowed to ride on the sidewalk, you got to follow some really specific and important rules. And I've listed those here. One is that you always have to yield the right of way to pedestrians. Another is that before passing pedestrians, you have to give an audible warning, which could be with your voice saying on your left. It could be with a bell, like you just heard my kiddo ringing over there. That's an important one. This third one, I think, is probably the most important because we hear about an awful lot of collisions that happen in places where sidewalk riding bicyclists cross driveways or streets. And the rule is that a bicyclist crossing a driveway or entering a crosswalk has to slow down to a walking speed. And of course, the idea is that at those crossings, you're expecting things to approach at a walking speed and not at 15, 20 miles an hour. So that's the rule. And on a bike, that's a big deal. You know, you're riding along on a sidewalk, and you got to slow down to a walking speed, which is like 3 miles an hour. It feels like you're going really slow on a bike, but the rule makes sense. But I don't think a lot of folks know about it. And our office hears a lot from folks who are riding on sidewalks because a lot of times they don't know the best bike routes. So like in Northeast, a lot of the best bike routes are these neighborhood greenways on side streets. And people who aren't real familiar with that neighborhood greenway network kind of try to ride on the same streets that they would drive on, which aren't always the best bike streets. But those are the roads they know. I still remember when I first bike commuted to a job I had at the Boys and Girls Club on MLK when I was 16. I rode my bike from the Max station at Lloyd Center down MLK. And I thought there's got to be a better way, but I didn't know. And so I think on streets like MLK, on, you know, bigger like 4-lane roads, people oftentimes take to the sidewalk because they don't feel comfortable in the street and they don't necessarily know about other routes. But they're trying to get where they want to go. So we hear about a lot of collisions that happen on those kinds of higher speed, wider roads where people are riding on the sidewalk, and this statute comes up. Another one is with respect to electric bikes. I've got one of those cargo bikes that has a big old wooden box in the front, and I can put my kids in there, and it's great. And technically, when I used to drop my kids off at school, pull up on the sidewalk outside of their school, that was illegal under Oregon law. You're not supposed to have an electric bike on the sidewalk or ride an electric bike on the sidewalk. I did it very carefully. Okay. Some examples. One of my favorite rides is this Kelly Point Path, which is an off-street multi-use path that goes out to Kelly Point in North Portland. And legally, this path most neatly falls into the definition of a sidewalk. Even though everyone treats it as a multi-use path, it's likely a sidewalk legally. And therefore, at all these crossings that it has with these big, there's like Amazon's out there, a bunch of big warehouses. At all those crossings, the bicyclist is supposed to slow down to a walking speed, which for someone on a workout ride going out to, for a 25-mile ride, it's a tough thing to comply with. So it's sort of one of those things that if you don't know about it, it's easy to have infrastructure like this that doesn't exactly make it feel natural to comply with that. Okay. The next thing I want to talk about is crosswalk law. And this comes up both for people who are riding their bikes on the sidewalk. If you're allowed to ride your bike on a sidewalk somewhere, then you're also allowed to use the crosswalk. You're not required to dismount before going through a crosswalk. You can ride through the crosswalk, again, as long as you slow to a walking speed. But this applies to bicyclists and pedestrians. And the big one is that every corner is a crosswalk. And what this means is that even at intersections where there's no traffic signal and no paint on the ground, there are still what we call unmarked crosswalks, which provide the right-of-way to people crossing and require that drivers and bicyclists in the street that are approaching those unmarked crosswalks slow down, stop, and yield the right-of-way to the people crossing. And this is a big, powerful thing for pedestrian rights because it allows people who are trying to cross the street in places that don't have a bunch of infrastructure to assert their right to cross and require cross traffic to slow down and stop. Now, there's I don't know if you all are familiar with, there's an old YMCA in Hollywood in Northeast, and it's right on Northeast Broadway, which is a big, wide, 3 or 4 lane street without a lot of signals or crosswalks. And to take my 5-year-old to basketball practice there, I had to cross Broadway a lot. And I'll tell you that this is not a statute that many drivers who saw us trying to cross there knew about or complied with. But I think it was mostly about just knowing about it. But so the way it works is that if you enter the right-of-way by moving in the roadway with the intent to proceed, which means putting your foot or your cane or your bike wheel into the roadway, then cross traffic on that street is required to slow down and stop for you as long as they can do it safely. You can't suddenly leave the curb and move into the path of the vehicle that's so close as to constitute a hazard. But
Hey, Chris,
hey,
a quick question on that.
yeah,
A driver is not required to stop at a marked or unmarked crosswalk for a bicyclist if that bicyclist is on the bike. Only when he's off the bike and holding the bike.
yeah, that's great. So as a matter of fact, if the bike rider is stopped at the crosswalk and stays on the bike and rolls their front wheel into the crosswalk, the unmarked crosswalk, and then that is enough to assert their right to the road, and then they can then ride through that unmarked crosswalk. They're not required to dismount.
Didn't know that. Thanks.
Yeah. So some examples of where this comes up often are, side streets where there's uncontrolled intersections or no paint on the ground throughout, the east side of Portland, especially. Also, like I just said, big arterial streets. So here's an example. Hey, buddy. Hey, no, thank you. No, thank you. No, thank you. Hey, you want some of that? So here's an example of Northeast Broadway, like I was just talking about. And sadly, this statute is so frequently not complied with that I was able to go on Google Maps Street View and find a fellow who was waiting for people to stop for him in a matter of minutes over here on 22nd and Broadway.
Mm-hmm.
And so in this situation, this is a guy who's clearly got his feet in the roadway and has the intent to proceed. And it's clear from the Google Maps photos that he's having to wait there for quite a while if you kind of proceed down the road. And this is not uncommon. But where this guy's standing is he's within an unmarked crosswalk, which is where a crosswalk would be if it were marked. Everyone kind of knows that crosswalks connect sidewalks across roads, and that's where you draw the lines, or that's where you draw the boundaries of the unmarked crosswalk.
Chris,
Sure.
Becky Lilliquist from Bridal Mile.
Hi.
What about a wheelchair? I'm an electric.
Yep. So similar deal. So if I don't have it listed here, but if you look at the statute, it's ORS 811.
When the light.
Yeah. So if you were to, and I know it's not always an easy right to assert, because it does require that you move some part of your body out into the roadway. But if you put the front wheel of your wheelchair, I sometimes, actually I've got one right here. My son's been playing with this lightsaber here, and sometimes when I'm walking at night, I'll in the dark winter months, I'll bring this with me and light it up and wave it out in the roadway to demonstrate our intent to proceed. So it can be anything, as long as it's like part of your person, part of your equipment that you're traveling with.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Chris.
Sure. So another place this comes up is, so I talked about neighborhood greenways earlier, and these are real common on the east side, and they've grown. The network has grown significantly in the last several years, and the places where these neighborhood greenway side streets cross busier arterial roads oftentimes have a bunch of paint on the ground, and some of that paint is these white zebra stripes, which we all know to be marked crosswalks. Other paint are these green zebra stripes that are a little bit harder to see, but they're right next to the white ones. And what they call, those are not part of the crosswalk, because they are too far into the intersection. And those are actually called cross bikes. And the interesting thing about those is, unlike crosswalks, which have a ton of legal authority, cross bikes actually give the rider no additional rights legally. So there's no statutory definition of a cross bike. It's just paint on the ground designed to signal that bikes might be in the area. And in fact, the bike rider at this intersection who is crossing the street, who would be traveling through those that green cross bike, they actually face a stop sign. here, and are required to stop and yield the right-of-way until it's clear. But what the city of Portland is trying to do here, I think, is to kind of encourage drivers on this busier street to voluntarily slow down and stop when they see bike riders, even though they're not legally required to, you know, to exercise their own goodwill and kind of, especially during rush hour when there's a lot of traffic, and give bike riders a chance to get through, because these tend to be high volume bike streets, especially during commute hours, and it can be hard to find a gap in traffic. And a lot of drivers will politely see a bike, slow down and stop, and I think probably some of them think they're legally required to, because they think, oh, this is kind of like a crosswalk for bikes, I better slow down and stop. But as a lawyer who is a stickler for the law, these create a little bit of ambiguity, because they give people a sense of legal protection that they don't actually have. And I have certainly, when I've been bike commuting through town, I've seen people on bikes assume that they can kind of roll out into these things and force cross traffic to stop. I haven't seen any collisions, but I'm afraid that if one happened, it would be a tough liability situation for that bike rider. I've also seen situations where I was riding on the Greenway and a car saw me and sort of panicked almost, thinking, oh, I better stop quick, and slammed on their brakes and almost got rear-ended. And they were trying to do me a favor, or I think they thought that they were legally required to stop. But in fact, what they were doing is doing something they weren't legally required to do. And so it's an interesting dynamic. It's designed to help bike riders get through town a little more easily. But certainly it creates a little ambiguity.
Hey, Chris.
Hey.
This is Scott Israel. I'm also from Bridle Mile.
Okay.
And I'm not clear why that situation that you're describing carries less right than the previous situation, which you described at an unmarked cross section, where if I come up to the intersection on my bike and I pause and I'm clearly intending to cross, traffic is supposed to stop for me. How is this less?
Right. I appreciate that question, because I don't think I was very clear about that distinction. So if you look at this picture, there's a white crosswalk, these white stripes. And if a bike rider is riding on the sidewalk and is going to cross on the white stripes, then they have the right of way.
Okay.
Because they're kind of like a pedestrian. But if they move like 5 feet to their left and are instead crossing as a vehicle in the street in this green cross bike, then they're no longer in a crosswalk, and so they can't force cross traffic to stop. They are basically just another vehicle that faces a stop sign that is required to yield the right of way to cross traffic.
What if I'm riding in the street and I move to the right into the white crosswalk? I mean, I've not been on the sidewalk, but I move myself into the white paint.
Right. So bike riders have the benefit of being able to sometimes behave like vehicles in the street and sometimes like pedestrians. And as long as that maneuver is done in a way that's, you know, reasonable and careful, and in a place where you're allowed to ride on the sidewalk, and you enter the crosswalk at a walking speed, all those things that you got to do if you're a bike rider on the sidewalk, then you can do it. But you gotta be real careful, because yeah, it's just but yeah, there are certain intersections where the bike faces a stop sign and there's like actually a signal for the crosswalk, and a lot of times in that situation, especially if I'm riding with my kids or something, I'll actually go up on the sidewalk and hit the button for the signal, just to help get me across.
And then
Chris, I
can you
have,
cross with the pedestrian walk signal before the light turns from red to green?
Before the light turns from red to green.
Mhm.
What? So, which? So, are you talking about like a signal or an intersection that's got traffic signals going all
Yes.
ways?
Yes, it's got a signal, and the pedestrian walk sign turns to walk to allow the pedestrians to get out into the intersection before
Right.
the traffic
Right.
moving the same way is allowed to start. As a
Right.
bike, may I go with the pedestrian
If,
timing, or do I
if
have to
you're,
wait?
I would say, they call that a leading pedestrian interval.
Yeah.
And I think if you're on the sidewalk, then you're subject to the pedestrian signal. And if you're in the street, then you're subject to the vehicle traffic signal.
Okay.
That would be my thought on that.
Okay.
Chris, I have one question.
Sure.
When it comes, how far back are you supposed to stop at a green box on the street?
Oh, good, good. I'm glad you brought that up because I don't have a slide for that. But the green box is designed, and I wish I did have a slide of that, but they're called bike boxes, and you guys are probably familiar with seeing them around town. And what those are designed to do is to allow bike riders to come up to the front of a row of stopped cars and become extra visible. And usually right before the green box is a white line. And that's where the motor vehicle traffic is supposed to stop.
Okay,
But it's one of those sort of unusual pieces of infrastructure that isn't particularly intuitive. And I certainly didn't learn about when I was going through, driver training. And out riding, I see a lot of folks who don't know what to do with those. But I will say, as a bike rider, it is kind of nice to be able to roll up to the front and take the lane a little bit and be extra visible, especially if I'm riding with my kids or something.
thanks.
Yeah. Idaho Stop.
Oh,
This is a fun new one. This is a law that was around in Idaho which is not exactly known as being a progressive bike state, but they had this law for a long time. And what it
this should be
says
the
is that,
California law.
right, it's catching on. Washington just passed a similar version. But what it says is that bicyclists are allowed to treat stop signs as yield signs. And so if you're a bicyclist and you're approaching a stop sign and there's cross traffic, then you got to slow down and stop because you got to yield. But if you're approaching a stop sign and there's no cross traffic and there aren't any pedestrians trying to cross, then you can roll through the stop sign at a safe speed. So one term for it is treat a stop as yield. Stop as yield. And I think what it's designed to do is to reflect the fact that, on a bike, it's all about conserving momentum. And especially given that a lot of our bike network that's the most safe is on side streets where there tend to be more stop signs. If bicyclists were legally required to slow down and stop every block or two where there's a stop sign, it would add a fair amount of exertion to the task. And so it was actually, I put a picture here of Ladd's Edition because this is a place where there was a sting operation to cite bicyclists for not stopping at these stop signs. But in terms of like our work as injury lawyers, stop as yield or Idaho Stop doesn't really change anything, because before this passed, if somebody blew a stop sign and got hit, then it was their fault. And now if somebody blows a stop sign and gets hit, it's still their fault because they didn't yield. So the effect is the same. There was some opposition to it by thinking it would be confusing for like kids to comply with, or make bike riders fly through at a high speed. But the statute says you got to slow down to a safe speed. like I said, Washington just passed it. I think another state, maybe Colorado or someplace passed it, so it's catching on a little bit. Okay, hand signaling. So the rule with hand signals is that for 100 feet before turning or stopping, you're required to signal your intent to do so. And you can do that by pointing in the direction you're going to turn, you know, just as you would expect. And another way to signal your intention to turn right is actually to point up. And then, so yeah, left, right, and then stop is straight down like that. But there's a really important exception to this one, because a lot of people don't feel comfortable riding with one hand on the handlebar for 100 feet before they're going to do something. I certainly don't in certain circumstances. If I'm trying to brake at the same time, it's tough to do that with one hand. So if circumstances require that both hands be on the handlebars to safely operate the bike, then you don't have to do this. You don't have to comply with this. I would suggest that even if you feel a little bit uncertain about signaling and safely, that you try to do it at least for long enough to give people a sense of what you're trying to do, especially if you're turning. I feel like the requirement to stop is a little bit silly, because you don't hear about a whole lot of like rear end bike collisions where someone says, "Oh, I didn't realize you were slowing down." That one's usually pretty self-evident, but we do hear about collisions involving people turning without other, bicyclists hitting other bicyclists without realizing that they were going to turn. So I think that's an important one. Electric bikes are great. They're growing fast. I've got a cargo bike, like I said, and if it were not electric, it would be really tough because it weighs about 100 pounds, and then much more than that with the kids in it. But they do have some specific rules that apply to them. One is that the motor can't be so powerful that it adds more than 20 miles an hour to the speed. Another is that, generally they're treated as bicycles. So everything I just said about bicycles generally applies to electric bikes. Some differences: they're not allowed to be, you're not allowed to ride an electric bike in a Portland park. And Portland parks include Waterfront Park, the East Side Esplanade, Springwater Corridor, which are places where people ride e-bikes all the time without even realizing that's a rule. And it's sort of an outdated rule. It was written, I think, a long time ago, and it was, and actually the state of Oregon had a similar rule for their state parks that they recently changed. I would hope that the city of Portland would, try to regulate e-bike riding a little bit and allow it in those places under certain conditions, instead of just banning it entirely, because the fact is that those are some of the safest places to ride. But that's the current state of it. You can't ride on sidewalks. And this last one is kind of interesting. You got to be 16 or older to ride an e-bike. And nowadays, some of the e-bikes are so easy to ride. It's basically like riding a regular bike, but it adds a little bit of power. And I was actually talking to some middle schoolers about bicycles not too long ago, and one of them had an e-bike that they loved riding because they lived in the West Hills, and it allowed them to go to their friends' houses, and they weren't old enough to drive yet. But technically, you're supposed to be 16 to ride an e-bike.
How about on the 16 and older? Do they require license and insurance on those motorbikes?
Yeah. So if it's a regular old electric bike, then it's sort of uncharted territory. Whether whether an insurance company would try to say that that's a motor vehicle that's not on the policy, and therefore we're not going to cover it. We haven't heard that argument, but a creative insurance company, I suppose, could make it. The fact is that these, for the most part, these bikes have speed limit. You know, this sort of governor, can't add more than 20 miles an hour. Most of them seem a lot like ordinary bikes. There are
How
certainly
about
some exceptions.
mopeds?
Yeah, mopeds are their own beast, and I don't know offhand. I think those are probably considered motor vehicles and therefore not something that you can get insurance for. But let's talk about insurance here in a minute because I want to talk about that
Okay.
last.
All right.
And we're
Good
coming up
question.
on. Yeah, go ahead.
Got a question. Didn't you say earlier that bicycles were considered motor vehicles?
That's a good point. So that was for purposes of the vehicle code. So if you look at the Oregon vehicle code provisions that say motor vehicles have to stop at stop signs or go the speed limit or other things, that likely does apply to bikes. But when it comes to insurance law, then that's actually a separate section of the Oregon statutes. And
Starting to get confusing.
yeah, it's got its own definitions, and so that statute I mentioned doesn't apply to the insurance code.
Oh, thanks.
Yep. Okay. Car doors.
Yeah.
We see a lot of these collisions, unfortunately. A lot of bike lanes are in the door zone next to parked cars. The rule is before you open a car door, you got to make sure that it's clear. Otherwise, the person opening the door is at fault. And there's a pretty clear statute that says that. I want to jump to insurance because I think this is one that a lot of people don't spend a lot of time thinking about, but unless they get in a collision, and then they're like, hang on, what covers me? And it's actually kind of nice. So if you own a car and you have car insurance, or you qualify under someone else's car insurance as an insured person, then when you're out riding your bike or walking, if you get hit by a car, then you can get benefits under your own auto insurance, even though your car is at home in the driveway. And one of those benefits is called personal injury protection, PIP, which covers your medical expenses up to $15,000, as well as some wage loss. And it doesn't matter who's at fault. That covers you no matter what. That's a big one. Another one is really important, especially in serious injury cases. And it's called uninsured, underinsured motorist coverage, UM/UIM. And that insures you against the risk that you get hit by somebody who has no insurance or who doesn't have enough insurance. And it allows you to make a claim against your own insurance as if they were the at-fault driver. And this one is really important because there's so many people driving around without insurance or without enough insurance to cover the damage that they cause. And this one covers you on your bike and when you're walking. And a lot of our clients make use of it because they get hit by somebody who doesn't have insurance or who doesn't have very much. Of course, another pot of insurance proceeds potentially is the driver's insurance if they're at fault. Oregon requires that the driver carry at least $25,000 in coverage. California is $15,000. It's not a lot, you know. If you get seriously injured and you go to the hospital and you're there for a night or two, that pretty much takes up that whole money. So again, getting UM/UIM coverage is helpful. And if there's no no car involved, if it's like a collision between two bike riders, a bike rider and a pedestrian, it doesn't happen very often that those collisions cause serious injuries, but we've had some cases over the years involving bike on bike or bike on pedestrian. In that situation, there's no car involved. Auto insurance doesn't apply, but homeowners and renters policies have liability coverage. It's like general liability coverage. And that usually comes in and covers it. So hopefully you don't ever need to make use of any of these coverages, but it's a nice thing to know about before something happens. All right. Well, that's all I've got, folks. Thank you all for the engaged attention and the questions, and I really appreciated it. And
Thank you so much.
not to mention your patience with having Wells making a bunch of noise in the background.
No, thank you so much, Chris. We appreciate your expertise and your dedication to education of the public and our
Yeah.
safety. So thank
Well,
you so much.
Yeah, thanks again for having me. I appreciate it.
Very nice. Good.
All right,
Good information.
great.
No, thanks, Chris.
Thanks all. I'm gonna log off now. But if you all have any questions that come up, please feel free to email or call me, and you can find us on our website.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Don't forget to stop screen share.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate it. All right, there we go. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Chris.
Hey,
Okay, Sylvia, so I think for the rest of our meeting, we can dispense with the recording.
okay. I'm going to take back the host and so I can do that.
Okay.
I have a feeling that